Apache Woman in the Winter Creek, The Drifter Who Saved Her Life, a Wild West true grit tale. The winter wind cut sharply across the rocky hills of the Wild West, making the world seem smaller and lonelier than it already was. Snow lay in thin patches over the uneven ground, crunching softly under any footstep, and the sky was a pale gray, heavy with clouds that promised even more cold. Along the banks of Winter Creek, the water moved quietly, a narrow ribbon of life threading through the frozen land. To anyone passing by, it might have seemed peaceful, but to the Apache woman who struggled along its edges, it was both hope and danger. She had been traveling alone for days, her body tired, her spirit weary, and her mind alert to every sound around her. Her name had been whispered among her people, but now, lost and separated, it felt like a distant echo. She had been a part of a strong, close-knit community, where every member knew each other's strengths and weaknesses. Yet a sudden conflict, one that had come without warning, had torn her away from that safety. She remembered the sounds of shouting, the dust in the air, the hurried footsteps, and the fear in the eyes of those she loved. In that chaos, she had run, following instinct and knowledge passed down from her elders. She had survived because she knew how to read the land, how to find food where others saw only rocks, and how to hide from danger when it came. But she was only human, and after days in the cold, hunger and exhaustion began to weigh heavily upon her. She moved slowly along the creek, her fingers brushing against the bare branches of trees, her eyes scanning the frozen ground for any signs of movement. Her clothing, once sturdy and practical, was now worn thin in places, the fabric stiff from the cold. She had a small satchel at her side, holding the few items she had managed to keep: a piece of dried meat, a small water flask, and a handful of medicinal herbs. Each step was a struggle, and she often paused to rest, leaning against a tree or the slope of a small hill, listening to the whispers of the wind. Despite her exhaustion, she remained alert. She had learned from her people that danger could appear at any moment. Hunters, wild animals, or even soldiers searching for those who did not belong. The Apache had taught her to read the land, to notice the faintest tracks in the snow, the broken twigs that suggested movement, the tiny differences in the sound of the wind. Every detail mattered, and she could not afford to let her guard down. She pressed on, driven by the thought that Winter Creek might lead her to safety, perhaps even to someone who could help her. As the day wore on, her hunger grew sharper, gnawing at her belly like an insistent animal. She remembered the berries that sometimes grew near streams, hidden under branches or rocks. She searched carefully, knowing that the wrong plant could make her sick or worse. Her hands shook as she collected a few small, dark berries. Grateful that her knowledge of the land allowed her to survive even in such harsh conditions, she chewed them slowly, savoring the taste, the small burst of energy giving her just enough strength to continue. The creek itself was a strange companion. Its water was partially frozen, forming thin layers of ice that shimmered in the pale sunlight. Sometimes she would kneel to drink, careful not to fall into the icy water, and feel a brief warmth from the motion of her own body. She watched the stream winding through the rocks, imagining it as a guide leading her to safety. But she also knew the creek could be dangerous. Hidden under the snow and ice, deep pockets of water waited to trap the unwary, and slippery stones could send her tumbling. She moved with care, each step deliberate, each breath measured. Night came sooner than she expected. The pale gray of the sky darkened, and shadows stretched long across the land. The wind howled through the rocks, rattling loose branches and chilling her to the bone. She knew she needed shelter. There were few places to hide in this rugged terrain, and she had no tools to make a proper fire. But she remembered a small cave she had spotted earlier, tucked behind a cluster of rocks near the creek. With the last of her strength, she crawled toward it, her hands scraping against the rough stone, her knees aching from the effort. Finally, she reached the cave, its dark mouth offering a faint promise of protection. Inside, it was small but dry, and she huddled against the cold stone, wrapping her arms around her knees. Her teeth chattered, and she shivered despite her efforts to stay warm. She tried to sleep, but exhaustion and fear kept her eyes open. In the silence of the cave, she could hear every sound: the creek moving outside, the wind rattling loose stones, and the faint scratching of an animal somewhere nearby. She breathed deeply, trying to calm herself, repeating the words of her elders in her mind. They had taught her resilience, courage, and patience. She had survived before, and she would survive again. As darkness deepened, she thought of her people, wondering where they were, if they were searching for her, if they were safe. The memory of her home, the warmth of the fire, the laughter of children, the voices of elders telling stories, brought both comfort and sorrow. She allowed herself a few tears, not out of weakness but because she was human, and the journey had been relentless. She reminded herself that tears could cleanse the soul. That feeling did not mean surrender. Hours passed slowly. The wind outside howled with greater force, but inside the cave she felt a fragile sense of safety. She arranged small stones to block drafts and gathered dried leaves to make a thin bed. Hunger still gnawed at her, but she saved her strength, knowing that moving in the dark could be more dangerous than waiting. She listened to the creek, letting its gentle murmur remind her that life continued, even in hardship. She thought about the future, uncertain as it was. The snow would not last forever, and the creek might lead her to other travelers, or perhaps to a place where she could find food and warmth. She held on to hope like a lifeline, small and fragile, but enough to keep her moving. She knew the winter was merciless, but she also knew that her people's teachings had given her skills no storm could take away. Her mind wandered to the stories of brave women who had survived against impossible odds, and she drew strength from them, imagining herself walking in their footsteps. Hours turned into a long, cold night. She drifted in and out of sleep, her body curled tight for warmth, her dreams filled with memories of home and fear of the unknown. She thought of the creek as both a friend and a guide, whispering promises of life ahead. Each moment was a test of endurance, each breath a victory. She felt pain, cold, and hunger, but also a stubborn determination to survive. She had come too far to give up now, and she knew that somewhere beyond the frozen hills and rocks, a chance for safety awaited. By the first light of morning, she was exhausted, her body weak but her spirit unbroken. She rose slowly, stretching stiff limbs and looking toward the horizon. The creek glistened in the pale sunlight, flowing steadily as if urging her onward. With renewed determination, she began walking again, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. Every step was careful, deliberate, guided by her knowledge, instinct, and the small spark of hope that had kept her alive through the night. She did not know what she would find. Perhaps another traveler, perhaps danger, perhaps a way back to her people. But she walked forward, step by step, trusting her instincts, the lessons of her elders, and the whisper of the creek that had become her silent companion. The winter of the Wild West was harsh, unyielding, and unforgiving. Yet the Apache woman pressed on, driven by the unshakable truth that survival belonged to the brave, the patient, and those willing to fight with every ounce of strength they had. In that frozen wilderness, with snow under her feet and the wind biting at her skin, she embodied resilience. She was alone, yes, but not defeated. And as the creek wound its way through the land, unseen by most, it carried the promise that even in the harshest winters, life could endure, courage could shine, and hope could guide the lost toward safety. The drifter had been on the road for weeks, maybe months. He had long since stopped counting. He was a man shaped by solitude and hardship, carrying no home, no family, and no name that anyone could call him by. Some people might have thought he was aimless, wandering from town to town, following the tracks of horses and the paths of rivers, always moving, never staying. But he was more than that. He was careful, observant, and quietly skilled in surviving where others would fail. He had learned how to read the land, how to find water, how to start a fire with almost nothing, and how to stay alive in a world that could turn against you in an instant. On this particular winter morning, the drifter rode slowly through a frozen valley. The wind cut across the plains, sharp and bitter, but he had grown used to it. His horse moved steadily, its breath steaming in the cold air, and together they followed a narrow trail along the hills. He scanned the ground constantly, noticing every detail: the faint scrape of a rock, the indentation of a boot, the tracks of an animal. Years of wandering had made him notice the smallest things, and he trusted those details to keep him alive. When he came close to Winter Creek, he noticed something unusual. There were footprints, faint and uneven, moving along the bank. They were small, clearly made by a woman or a young person, and they seemed hurried, almost desperate. The drifter frowned. Few people traveled here alone, and fewer still in the dead of winter. He dismounted and examined the tracks, his sharp eyes tracing them back and forth in the snow. The footprints were interrupted at one point, as though the traveler had fallen or paused, then continued. He knew from experience that such details told a story, sometimes the difference between life and death, curiosity mixed with caution. The drifter knew he could follow the tracks, but he also knew the land was dangerous. Wild animals roamed these hills, and humans could be even more dangerous. Bandits and soldiers often traveled through these remote places, and any encounter could turn deadly. Still, something about the tracks drew him on. Maybe it was the instinct that told him a person needed help, or maybe it was the silent hope that he was not as alone as he thought. He followed the footprints carefully, moving slowly so he would not alert anyone or anything to his presence. The tracks led him to a small clearing near the creek, and there he saw her, the Apache woman, lying close to the water, motionless. At first, he thought she might be dead, but then he noticed her chest rising and falling with faint, uneven breath. Her clothing was thin against the winter cold, her skin pale and her hair tangled and damp from the snow. She had fallen while trying to navigate the rocks, and now she lay weak and vulnerable, unable to move. The drifter hesitated. Helping her could be dangerous. Settlers or soldiers might be nearby, and stopping could attract attention. But leaving her would mean certain death. He had seen too much of the world to ignore a person in need. He approached carefully, keeping his horse calm, and knelt beside her. He checked her pulse and touched her arm. It was cold, but she was alive. Relief mixed with concern. He knew he had to act fast if she was to survive the winter night. He lifted her gently, careful not to hurt her further, and helped her onto his horse. She stirred but did not resist, her eyes half open, confused and wary. She did not speak his language, and he did not speak hers, but words were not necessary. Actions could say more than language ever could. He adjusted her position so she would not fall and wrapped a blanket around her thin frame, sharing the small warmth he had. Every movement was slow, deliberate, and careful. One wrong step could send them both into the icy water or leave them exposed to the cold. The drifter guided his horse away from the creek toward a narrow valley he knew would offer shelter. He thought about his options. There was an old trapping cabin nearby, abandoned for years, but still sturdy enough to provide protection from the wind and snow. It would not be comfortable, but it would be safe. He had survived worse, and now he could help her survive too. As they moved, he noticed her shivering and gave her more of his blanket. She looked at him with wide, alert eyes, trying to understand, trying to trust. Slowly, she relaxed just enough to rest her head against the blanket, letting him guide her through the frozen land. The ride was long and slow. The horse slipped on icy patches, and the drifter had to lead it carefully, sometimes dismounting to find safer ground. The woman remained silent, but he could feel her tension, her fear, and her exhaustion. He did not speak much either. The wind made words difficult, and silence often carried more meaning. Every now and then he pointed to a path, a rock, or a tree, using gestures to guide her understanding. Over time, they developed a simple rhythm, moving together as the cold stretched around them. Finally, they reached the small cabin tucked behind a hill. Its wooden walls had withstood years of winter storms, and inside there was a small space to rest. The drifter led his horse close and helped the woman inside. He made a small fire using dry wood he had collected along the way, and the warmth began to push back the chill that had penetrated her bones. She sat near the fire, wrapped in blankets, her hands reaching instinctively toward the heat. He observed quietly, noticing the way she watched the fire, the way her breathing changed, the way her eyes shifted from the flames to him and back again. He realized that survival required patience. She needed to recover slowly, regain strength, and learn to trust him. He prepared some simple food, dried meat and water, and offered it to her. She hesitated at first, unsure whether he meant her harm, but hunger won over fear. She ate slowly, careful with every bite, and he watched, silently pleased to see life returning to her. Over the next few days, the cabin became their temporary sanctuary. The drifter tended to her wounds using simple remedies he carried with him: herbs, clean water, and careful attention. She could not speak his language, but gestures, eyes, and small acts of care created a bond between them. She learned that he meant no harm, and he learned that she was strong, intelligent, and resourceful despite her weakened state. Each day they shared the small warmth of the fire, the quiet of the winter landscape, and the unspoken understanding that survival often depended on trust. Outside, the world remained harsh. Snow covered the ground in deeper layers. Wind bent the trees, and the creek flowed with a relentless coldness. But inside, the cabin offered a fragile protection, a small space where two strangers could exist without fear. The drifter spoke softly when he needed to, teaching her gestures, showing her small ways to move safely, and helping her regain confidence in her own strength. She listened, watched, and learned, absorbing every lesson with careful attention. Their days were filled with simple routines: collecting firewood, fetching water, tending to wounds, and sharing small portions of food. They shared stories in gestures and expressions, conveying memories of home, family, and past hardships. The Apache woman spoke little, but her eyes told stories of resilience, courage, and intelligence. The drifter shared what he could, revealing glimpses of a life lived on the road, a life of experience, caution, and silent wisdom. Together, they began to form an unspoken partnership, a bond forged not in words but in the act of surviving together. As the winter days passed, the drifter knew that staying at the cabin could not last forever. Danger could come in the form of wild animals, wandering men, or soldiers searching the land. The Apache woman was still not at full strength, and the winter would not wait for her to heal completely. He began to plan, thinking ahead to the journey that lay beyond the hills, beyond the snow, and eventually toward her people. Every decision had to balance caution with urgency, patience with action. The path ahead would be difficult, but he knew they had a chance if they prepared carefully. One evening, as the fire crackled and the wind rattled the walls of the cabin, the woman finally spoke a few words, hesitant and soft. He did not understand them, but he could sense the gratitude, the relief, and perhaps a small curiosity. He smiled gently, offering a nod and a gesture that said without words, "You are safe here, for now." She returned the gesture, her eyes reflecting the flickering flames and a cautious trust. It was a small victory, but in the harsh winter of the Wild West, every small victory mattered. The drifter did not know what tomorrow would bring. Perhaps the journey would remain difficult. Perhaps danger would come too soon. But he knew that for now they had survived together, each keeping the other alive. In the silence of the cabin, with the fire warming their bodies and the snow falling outside, a story of trust, courage, and survival was quietly being written, one that neither of them could have imagined when they first set foot in the frozen wilderness. And in that moment, the drifter realized something important. Helping another person could change everything. It could mean the difference between life and death, despair and hope, loneliness and connection. It could create a bond stronger than words, stronger than fear, stronger than the harsh winter itself. He had not expected to meet anyone in this frozen land. Yet here she was, fragile but determined, and together they were no longer completely alone. The drifter had been thinking about the future ever since the Apache woman had begun to regain her strength. He knew the winter would not last forever, but it could still be merciless. Snowstorms could appear without warning, freezing temperatures could strike suddenly, and dangers lurked everywhere. Wild animals, hidden ice, even other travelers who might not be friendly. He had faced many harsh winters on the road, but helping another person changed everything. Every decision now mattered not only for himself, but also for the woman who had become dependent on him for survival. Inside the cabin, the small fire burned steadily, sending warmth across the cramped wooden floor. The woman sat near it, her fingers slowly thawing from the cold that had seeped into her bones. She had grown quieter over the past days, speaking only in short gestures, small words, and hesitant phrases. The drifter watched her carefully, knowing that trust was not given easily, and that fear could return if he made even the smallest mistake. He had learned the value of patience over years of wandering alone, and he applied it now more carefully than ever. Every morning he would check the supplies they had collected: firewood, dried meat, water from the creek, and plan for the day. He taught the woman how to recognize signs in the snow, the tracks of a deer, the faint marks of a coyote, the places where ice might be too thin to cross. She listened closely, absorbing each lesson. Her movements were still careful, sometimes hesitant, but she was learning quickly. Each day she regained a little strength, each day she smiled a little more, and each day she began to move with more confidence. Outside, the winter was relentless. Snow drifted across the hills, blanketing the ground and hiding the familiar landmarks. The wind whistled through the rocks and trees, rattling branches against the cabin's walls. Yet despite the cold and isolation, the drifter and the woman found small moments of warmth and connection. They shared stories without words, using gestures, facial expressions, and small acts of care. Sometimes she would draw a line in the dirt, showing where she had come from, or point to the sky, telling him about the sun and stars in her homeland. He would respond with a nod or a small smile, signaling understanding, even if words failed them both. Food remained scarce, and every meal required careful planning. The drifter taught her how to stretch their supplies, how to ration water and dried meat, and how to forage for anything edible near the creek. They discovered small roots and herbs hidden under the snow, and the woman would gather them carefully, her hands numb from the cold. They boiled water over the fire, used herbs for minor ailments, and slowly built a routine that balanced survival with safety. Each small success became a reason to hope, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, life could persist. One evening, after a day of careful work gathering wood and checking traps, the drifter noticed a shadow moving outside the cabin. He froze, listening intently. Winter had taught him that even the smallest noise could signal danger. He motioned to the woman to stay quiet and still. Slowly he peered through a crack in the wooden wall and saw nothing, just the snow and the darkened hills. Yet his instincts told him to remain alert. It was a reminder that the world beyond the cabin remained unpredictable. The Apache woman watched him closely, sensing his caution, and for the first time she began to understand the depth of the dangers that surrounded them. The bond between them grew stronger with each passing day. She began to rely on him not just for survival, but for guidance, protection, and reassurance. He, in turn, respected her courage, intelligence, and resilience. Her silence no longer seemed like fear. It became a quiet strength, a way of observing the world and learning from it. They shared moments of laughter when a small animal startled them or when they managed to catch a tiny fish from the creek. These small joys made the cold and hardship easier to bear, reminding them both that even in the wilderness, life could hold moments of light. Healing, however, was slow. The woman still carried a wound from her fall, a reminder of the fragility of life in the winter wilderness. The drifter cleaned it carefully, using boiled water and herbs he had collected. He wrapped it with strips of cloth, ensuring it would not reopen. She winced sometimes, but never complained, and over time, the wound began to heal. Each day she grew stronger, moving with more confidence, testing the frozen ground outside the cabin, and learning to trust her own steps. Communication remained a challenge, but necessity made them creative. The drifter taught her a few basic gestures and simple words he thought she might understand. She responded with her own signs, pointing to objects, drawing shapes in the dirt, and using expressions to communicate feelings and needs. They began to develop a language of survival, one that relied on shared experience rather than spoken words. In the quiet moments by the fire, they would sit together exchanging these gestures, feeling a connection deeper than words could express. One particularly harsh night, a snowstorm blew through the hills. The wind rattled the cabin, and snow piled against the walls. The drifter stoked the fire, keeping it burning bright, while the woman sat close, warming her hands and shoulders. The storm was relentless, but they were safe, protected by the cabin and by each other's presence. In that moment, the woman felt something she had not felt for days: hope. She realized that she might survive not just physically but emotionally as well. The drifter's calm presence, steady hands, and careful guidance gave her a sense of security she had not known since being separated from her people. The storm lasted through the night, and by morning the world outside had transformed into a sparkling winter wonderland. Snow coated every branch and rock, reflecting the pale sunlight. It was beautiful, yet dangerous. Every step outside could be treacherous, every hidden ice patch a threat. Still, the drifter led the woman outside for a short walk, testing her strength, helping her navigate the frozen creek, and teaching her how to move safely on slippery ground. She stumbled at first, but laughed softly, a sound that brought warmth to both of them. Step by step, she regained confidence, learning not just to survive, but to move forward with skill and awareness. Days turned into weeks. The cabin, once a temporary shelter, became a place of learning and recovery. They discovered small routines that helped them endure the winter, gathering firewood, checking the creek for fish, rationing supplies, and tending to wounds. Each day offered new lessons. She learned to move quietly through the snow, how to sense danger from distant sounds, how to find edible plants hidden under the frozen ground. The drifter admired her determination and sharp mind, realizing that she was more than a survivor. She was a partner in this harsh landscape. Over time, the bond between them deepened. Though they could not speak the same language, they understood each other through gestures, shared work, and quiet companionship. She learned to trust him completely, and he learned to respect her instincts, knowledge, and courage. Together they formed a rhythm. She moved with care, guided by his lessons. He watched her closely, ensuring she remained safe. They were no longer just a drifter and a lost woman. They were companions, surviving together in a world that showed no mercy to the weak. As winter slowly edged towards spring, the drifter realized that the time would soon come to leave the cabin. They could not stay hidden forever. The woman would need to return to her people, and the journey back would be difficult. They would face unknown terrain, possible dangers, and the challenges of moving through the wilderness together. But he also knew that she was ready. Her strength had returned, her skills had grown, and the trust between them had become unshakable. That evening, as they sat by the fire, the drifter packed some supplies, dried meat, water, herbs, and a few small tools that might help them on the road. The woman watched, understanding the plan without words. She packed what little she had with care, her movements steady and confident. The fire crackled, casting shadows on the walls of the cabin, and for a moment the world outside seemed to pause. In that silence, they shared a quiet understanding. The journey ahead would be dangerous, but they would face it together, relying on trust, courage, and the lessons they had learned during their time in the cabin. The Apache woman took a final look at the small cabin, the place that had sheltered her during the worst of winter. She felt gratitude for the drifter who had saved her life, who had shown her kindness and patience, and who had taught her not only to survive but to trust again. She touched the fire with her hand briefly, feeling its warmth, and then turned to him with a small, determined smile. The drifter nodded, understanding the unspoken message. It was time to continue, to move forward, and to face whatever the wilderness had in store. Together they stepped outside, the snow crunching under their feet, the wind biting at their faces, but their hearts strengthened by the bond they had formed. They moved carefully along the frozen creek, aware of every detail, ready for whatever lay ahead. Winter had tested them, challenged them, and forced them to rely on each other, and as they walked, side by side, they knew that the lessons they had learned, trust, courage, and resilience, would carry them through the journey yet to come. The days grew longer, but the winter was not yet gone. Snow still lay thick on the hills, and the wind carried a sharp, biting chill. The drifter and the Apache woman knew that staying in the cabin any longer would be dangerous. Rumors traveled even through the wilderness. Hunters, soldiers, and travelers could appear without warning. They had survived the harshest part of winter, but the journey ahead would test them in new ways. Careful planning became their priority. Every step, every movement had to be deliberate. Survival depended on preparation, patience, and trust. The drifter had spent many winters alone, traveling through frozen valleys and snow-covered hills, but he had never guided anyone on a journey so dangerous. The Apache woman, though strong and intelligent, had been weakened by her separation from her people and her fall near Winter Creek. Now she was recovering, her steps stronger, her breathing steadier, and her mind sharper. They began to prepare for travel, gathering what supplies they could carry and learning to move efficiently through the icy landscape. First, they focused on food. They collected dried meat, roots, and herbs from the creek area, carefully rationing every portion. The woman had learned quickly how to identify safe plants, fish from the icy water, and preserve what they found for the journey. The drifter showed her how to carry the supplies without overburdening themselves, packing them in small satchels and blankets that could be easily carried if the terrain became difficult. Every detail mattered. Hunger in the wilderness could weaken even the strongest person, and they both understood the importance of careful planning. Next, they prepared for shelter. The drifter had learned to find temporary shelters in the open wilderness, caves, hollowed trees, and small overhangs in the rocks. He taught the woman how to recognize the safest spots, how to gather firewood quickly, and how to build a small fire that could provide warmth without attracting attention. The Apache woman absorbed every lesson with care, understanding that knowledge of the land was as important as strength and endurance. Together they created a plan to travel carefully, moving by day, resting by night, and avoiding dangerous terrain whenever possible. They also prepared for possible encounters. The wilderness was unpredictable, and not every person they might meet would be friendly. The drifter taught the woman how to stay quiet, how to read tracks in the snow, and how to hide if necessary. They practiced moving silently, using gestures instead of words, and signaling to each other when danger might be near. Each practice helped build confidence, ensuring that both were ready for the challenges ahead. The bond between them grew stronger with every lesson, every shared task, and every small victory over the harsh environment. The Apache woman, who had once been frightened and wary, began to regain her spirit. She moved with a quiet strength, observing the landscape and noticing details the drifter sometimes overlooked. She watched the wind patterns, the color of the sky, and the movements of animals. She learned to predict when the snow might become unstable, when the creek's ice could give way, and when it was safe to move quickly. Her instincts, sharpened by the teachings of her people, complemented the drifter's experience, creating a partnership that balanced wisdom and skill. As they prepared for departure, the drifter studied the path ahead. The hills were treacherous, with narrow passes and hidden cliffs. The snow covered the ground unevenly, sometimes hiding dangerous ice or loose rocks. They would have to move carefully, taking the safest route even if it meant traveling slower. Every step required vigilance. He pointed out landmarks that would help them navigate. A large boulder shaped like a fallen tree, a cluster of rocks near the creek, and the bend in the water that signaled a deeper channel. She watched carefully, memorizing each sign to ensure they would not lose their way. On the morning of their departure, the world was quiet. Snow lay sparkling on every branch, and the cold air was sharp but manageable. The drifter adjusted the supplies on his horse and ensured the woman's pack was secure. He checked her clothing, making sure she was warm enough and that her movements would not be restricted. She returned his careful glance with a steady nod, her eyes reflecting determination. They had survived winter together, and now they would face the unknown together. The journey began slowly. The drifter led the way, carefully testing the ground, watching for thin ice, and guiding the woman along safe paths. She followed closely, learning from his movements, practicing balance, and observing the land with careful attention. The snow crunched beneath their feet, the wind whistled through the hills, and the creek ran silently alongside them. Each moment required concentration and care, but the act of moving forward filled them with quiet hope. Along the path, the Apache woman shared small stories of her people. Though they could not speak the same language fully, gestures, expressions, and simple words allowed them to communicate. She drew shapes in the snow to explain her memories of home, the circle of a fire, the tall grasses near the village, the paths she used to run as a child. The drifter listened carefully, absorbing her stories and responding with small nods, smiles, or gestures that indicated understanding. They connected not just through survival, but through shared humanity. As days passed, they encountered new challenges. Snowdrifts blocked their path, forcing them to detour over rocky hills. Ice hidden beneath snow made footing uncertain, requiring careful navigation. Cold winds cut through their clothing, chilling them even with layers and blankets. Yet they pressed on, relying on each other. The woman's observations often helped them avoid danger, while the drifters' experience ensured they did not take unnecessary risks. Together they became a seamless team, each step forward a testament to their growing trust and skill. One afternoon they spotted distant figures on the horizon. Fear immediately entered their minds, and the drifters signaled for the woman to hide behind a ridge. They crouched low, observing carefully. The figures appeared to be travelers, but it was impossible to know if they were dangerous. The drifter whispered gestures, teaching her how to remain silent and still. They waited until the figures passed, then resumed their journey, hearts pounding but spirits undeterred. The incident reminded them both of the unpredictability of the world, but also reinforced the importance of vigilance, preparation, and trust in each other. During moments of rest, they shared warmth by small fires, ate carefully rationed meals, and tended to minor injuries. The woman had developed confidence in her own abilities, gathering firewood, finding edible plants, and observing the terrain. The drifter admired her resilience, noting how far she had come since the day he found her near Winter Creek. Together they learned to move efficiently, adapt quickly, and survive against the harsh winter environment. Each day strengthened their bond, deepened their understanding of each other, and renewed their determination to reach safety. The Apache woman began to show signs of excitement and hope. She recognized landmarks that reminded her of her homeland, and spoke softly to the drifter, pointing toward the direction she believed would lead her people. Though communication was limited, the drifter understood her intentions and encouraged her, guiding them along safer routes. The journey was still difficult, but the woman's regained confidence and determination inspired them both. They moved not just to survive, but to reclaim a connection to home, family, and safety. By the time they reached the edge of a wide valley, the sun was setting, casting golden light across the snow. The drifter stopped, allowing the woman to take in the view. She paused, eyes reflecting the light and the hope it carried. It was a quiet moment of triumph, a small victory after days of struggle. Though the journey was far from over, they had survived together, learned from each other, and grown stronger in the process. The valley stretched ahead, promising both challenges and opportunities. That night, they camped near a small grove of trees. The drifter built a fire and gestured for the woman to rest. She wrapped herself in blankets, feeling the warmth seep into her body. They shared a quiet meal, rationing carefully, and watched the stars appear in the clear winter sky. Each star seemed to shine with the promise of guidance, of hope, of the life waiting for them beyond the frozen wilderness. They had faced the harshest part of winter, survived storms and danger, and learned to trust each other completely. The drifter reflected on their journey so far. He had been a man who wandered alone, shaped by years of solitude and hardship. But helping the Apache woman had changed him. It had reminded him of the power of trust, compassion, and quiet courage. He had taught her to survive, but she had also taught him something, that even in a world filled with danger and uncertainty, hope could be found, and life could endure through connection, patience, and determination. Together they rested that night, ready to continue their journey. Winter would not last forever, but the challenges ahead would require every skill, every ounce of patience, and every bit of courage they had learned. They had survived the storm of Winter Creek, healed wounds, built trust, and prepared carefully for the road ahead. And now, side by side, they would face the unknown, determined to reach safety, home, and the reunion that awaited the Apache woman. The morning air was crisp and clear, and the snow sparkled under the early sunlight. After weeks of careful travel, the drifter and the Apache woman were approaching the land she knew in her heart belonged to her people. The journey had been long, difficult, and filled with small dangers, but together they had survived every challenge. The creek had long disappeared from view, replaced by rolling hills and open plains, and now the woman could recognize the faint outlines of landmarks she remembered from her childhood. Rocks she had climbed, trees she had rested under, and a distant ridge that marked the edge of her homeland. The Apache woman's heart raced with excitement and nervousness. She could almost hear the voices of her people calling her name, almost see the warm fires of the village welcoming her home. Yet she also felt a deep sense of gratitude for the drifter who had guided her through the harshest winter she had ever known. He had been patient, cautious, and strong, yet gentle when needed. She had grown to trust him completely, relying not only on his skills but on the quiet courage he had shared. Every step forward was a mixture of hope, relief, and careful attention to the land. The drifter moved ahead, scanning the horizon for dangers. Though the area was more familiar to the woman, he could not afford to let his guard down. Wolves or coyotes could appear suddenly, hunters could cross their path, and icy patches could still hide beneath the thin snow. Every step required attention, and he led her with the experience of someone who had traveled countless miles alone in the wilderness. She followed closely, learning from his careful movements, watching the land, and noticing every detail. Together, they moved with the rhythm of people who had survived and learned from hardship. As they traveled, the woman began to share small stories of her people and home, drawing in the dirt and pointing toward distant landmarks. She spoke in her own language, soft words filled with emotion, and the drifter listened attentively. He could not understand her words, but he could understand her expressions, the way her hands moved and the look of longing and hope in her eyes. It was a reminder that connection did not always require language. Sometimes shared experience and trust could communicate far more. The terrain grew more challenging as they approached a narrow valley. Rocks jutted out from the snow and patches of ice covered hidden crevices. The drifter guided the woman carefully, showing her where to step and where to avoid. Her movements were precise, balanced, and confident, a testament to the lessons she had learned during their journey. Each step was a triumph over fear and weakness, and each moment of progress brought them closer to her home and safety. On the second day in the valley, the drifter noticed faint signs of other travelers, broken branches, distant tracks in the snow, and footprints leading toward the same path they were following. He signaled for the woman to hide behind a cluster of rocks. They crouched low, silent, watching and waiting. Hours passed, and the travelers did not approach closely, moving on their own path. It was a small victory, a reminder of the dangers that remained even near the edges of her homeland. But it also reinforced the need for vigilance, patience, and trust in each other. That night, they set up a small camp in a sheltered grove. The woman helped gather firewood and started a modest fire, her hands steady and confident. The drifter prepared a small meal, sharing it with her, and together they watched the stars emerge in the clear sky. The silence was comforting, filled with the quiet understanding of two people who had endured hardship together. She looked at him and offered a soft gesture of thanks, a movement of her hands and a gentle smile that spoke volumes. The drifter nodded, recognizing the bond they had formed, not just of survival, but of trust, respect, and shared experience. The final morning of their journey arrived with a sense of anticipation. The woman could see the faint outlines of her village in the distance, smoke rising from small fires, and the shapes of people moving among the buildings. Her heart pounded with excitement, and she instinctively moved faster, glancing at the drifter to ensure he was keeping pace. He stayed beside her, silently supporting her, guiding her through the last stretches of snowy fields, and ensuring they avoided any danger along the way. Every step brought her closer to home, yet she remained aware of the lessons the drifter had taught her: patience, vigilance, and careful observation of the world. Finally, they reached the outskirts of the village. Children ran past, playing in the snow, while adults worked near the fires tending to daily tasks. The Apache woman's eyes filled with tears of relief and joy as she recognized familiar faces, friends and family who had feared she might be lost forever. She called out, her voice trembling with emotion. Her people turned toward her, running to embrace her, surrounding her with warmth, care, and love. The reunion was filled with laughter, tears, and gratitude. Every step of her journey had led to this moment, and every hardship had made the embrace of her people even sweeter. The drifter stood back quietly, watching the reunion with a sense of satisfaction and humility. He had helped her survive, guided her safely, and now he witnessed the reward of their efforts: life restored, hope realized, and a homecoming achieved. The Apache woman turned toward him, her eyes shining with gratitude, and gestured for him to come closer. She could not speak his language fluently, but words were not needed. Her smile, her gestures, and the light in her eyes communicated everything. The drifter nodded, a quiet smile crossing his face, and understood that he had made a lasting impact on her life. The villagers welcomed the drifter with cautious curiosity. They recognized him as a man who had protected their loved one, and though he was a stranger, they respected his presence. They offered food, warmth, and shelter, gestures of gratitude for his courage and care. The drifter accepted quietly, his humility evident in his actions. He had never sought recognition, only survival and the chance to help when needed. In their eyes, he was a hero, but he knew the true reward was seeing the Apache woman safe, healthy, and reunited with her family. Over the next few days, the drifter and the woman shared stories of the journey with the villagers. Though some words were lost in translation, the events were understood. The winter storms, the frozen hills, the dangers they had faced, and the lessons learned. The villagers listened in awe, marveling at her resilience and at the quiet strength of the drifter who had guided her. Each story reinforced the bond that had formed between them, a bond built on survival, trust, and mutual respect. Though the woman had returned home, the drifter knew his journey would continue. He had been a wanderer all his life, moving from place to place, carrying no home and no ties. Yet, this experience had changed him. He had learned that helping another person could shape life in unexpected ways, that trust could form even between strangers, and that courage was not just about strength, but about patience, care, and persistence. He had guided the Apache woman through the harshest winter and watched hope and life return to her family. That knowledge would stay with him, wherever the road took him next. Before departing, the woman and the drifter shared a final moment together. She placed a hand gently on his arm, a silent gesture of gratitude and respect. He nodded, understanding the unspoken message. Her life had been changed, and he had been a part of it. She returned to the warmth of her village, ready to resume her life, while he mounted his horse and began to ride away, heading once more into the wide open land of the Wild West. As he rode, he reflected on the journey. Winter had tested them both, showing the harshness of the land, the dangers of the world, and the limits of human endurance. Yet it had also revealed the power of trust, the strength of courage, and the quiet rewards of compassion. The Apache woman had survived not only because of his guidance, but because of her own strength, intelligence, and resilience. Together, they had faced impossible odds and come through alive. Stories of their journey spread quietly across the frontier. Travelers spoke of the drifter who had saved an Apache woman during a bitter winter, of the courage and resilience that both had shown, and of the bond that had formed in the harshest of conditions. Every retelling added admiration for the drifter's care and the woman's strength, and each story reminded listeners that even in a land full of danger, humanity, trust, and courage could shine brightly. Though the drifter continued on his solitary path, he carried with him the memory of the woman and the lessons of their journey. He had been a wanderer before, but now he understood the impact one person could have on another. In the quiet moments of travel, he remembered her smiles, her determination, and the warmth of her gratitude. The Wild West remained a harsh and unpredictable place, but he rode forward with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that even the smallest acts of care could change the course of a life. The Apache woman returned to her people, forever marked by the winter she had survived and the stranger who had guided her. She shared her story, teaching others what she had learned, the importance of patience, the strength in quiet courage, and the power of trust. Though the drifter had moved on, his actions remained a part of her life and the lives of those she loved. The bond they had formed in the wilderness endured in memory, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, hope, bravery, and humanity could guide a person back to safety and home. In the end, Winter Creek became more than just a frozen stream. It became the setting for a story of survival, trust, and courage. The drifter continued his journey through the vast wild land, always alert, always moving, carrying with him the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had helped shape a life. The Apache woman thrived among her people, her spirit renewed, her resilience stronger, and her heart full of gratitude for the stranger who had walked beside her through the winter. Their paths had crossed for a reason, and though they would part ways, the story of that winter would live on, told again and again, a true testament to the human spirit.